All right, so for the record, this week I wanted to try something new where we have a prompt. So this could be kind of like a reactions video. It's a short video on Socrates and democracy. Let's jump right into it.
We're used to thinking very highly of democracy, and by extension, of ancient Athens, the civilization that gave rise to it. The Parthenon has become almost a byword for democratic values, which is why so many leaders of democracies like to be photographed there. It's therefore very striking to discover that one of ancient Greece's greatest achievements, philosophy, was highly suspicious of its other achievement, democracy. The founding father of Greek philosophy, Socrates, is portrayed in the dialogues of Plato as hugely pessimistic about the whole business of democracy. In Book 6 of the Republic, Plato describes Socrates falling into conversation with a character called Adimantus and trying to get him to see the flaws of democracy by comparing a society to a ship. If you were heading out on a journey by sea, asks Socrates, who would you ideally want deciding who was in charge of the vessel? Just anyone, or people educated in the rules and demands of seafaring? The latter, of course, says Adimantus. So why then, responds Socrates, do we keep thinking that any old person should be fit to judge who should be the ruler of a country? Socrates' point is that voting in an election is a skill, not a random intuition. And like any skill, it needs to be taught systematically to people. Letting the citizenry vote without an education is as irresponsible as putting them in charge of a trireme sailing to Samos in a storm. Socrates was to have first-hand catastrophic experience of the foolishness of voters. In 399 BC, the philosopher was put on trial on trumped-up charges of corrupting the youth of Athens. A jury of 500 Athenians was invited to weigh up the case and decided by a narrow margin that the philosopher was guilty. He was put to death by hemlock in a process which is, for thinking people, every bit as tragic as Jesus' condemnation has been for Christians. Crucially, Socrates was not elitist in the normal sense. He didn't believe that a narrow few should only ever vote. He did, however, insist that only those who had thought about issues rationally and deeply should be let near a vote. We have forgotten this distinction between an intellectual democracy and a democracy by birthright. We have given the vote to all without connecting it to wisdom. And Socrates knew exactly where that would lead, to a system the Greeks feared above all, demagoguery. Ancient Athens had painful experience of demagogues. For example, the louche figure of Alcibiades, a rich, charismatic, smooth-talking, wealthy man who eroded basic freedoms and helped to push Athens to its disastrous military adventures in Sicily. Socrates knew how easily people seeking election could exploit our desire for easy answers. He asked us to imagine an election debate between two candidates, one who was like a doctor and the other who was like a sweet shop owner. The sweet shop owner would say of his rival, "Look, this person here has worked many evils on you. He hurts you, gives you bitter potions, and tells you not to eat and drink whatever you like. He'll never serve you feasts of many and varied pleasant things like I will." Socrates asks us to consider the audience's response. Do you think the doctor would be able to reply effectively? The true answer, "I cause you trouble and go against your desires in order to help you," would cause an uproar among the voters, don't you think? We have forgotten all about Socrates' salient warnings against democracy. We have preferred to think of democracy as an unambiguous good rather than as something that is only ever as effective as the education system that surrounds it. As a result, we have elected many sweet shop owners and very few doctors.
Yeah, it was a good video. I liked it.
Yeah. So it struck me as interesting for two reasons. One is the irony of Socrates' end. I didn't know that's how he went out. It is kind of sad. Yeah. The other thing is kind of it's not just a straight slap in the face like screw democracy, right? I think it's a little bit more measured. It's kind of like, what are the merits of democracy? Like, because again, as it rightly pointed out in this video, I think in America, the idea of democracy is just kind of assumed good in many cases, right? very few people have a very clear articulation or rationale for what exactly is good about it, right? Because as the video points out, there are some clear downsides, right? So kind of, I mean, my hope for this session is just kind of us to discuss a little bit kind of reactions to the video and kind of think critically about, hey, what are the merits of democracy and what are the downsides? So anyone have any initial reactions? If this was, for example, your first time watching the video, because I've seen that this would be like my third time seeing it.
Yeah, so I think in America, I mean, obviously we're not uniquely democratic, but like I think we especially hold the right to be able to participate in the government that lords over us, right? I don't know. I feel like it's pretty integral to the foundation of our nation, right? Like, I think if you ask the average American, would you rather have better roads, healthcare, education, all these things, but you don't get a say in what happens to you, in what happens to your ruling body? I think most Americans would probably choose being able to vote, but worse public health or public good outcomes, right? And I feel like that's just because it's so core to the American identity.
I agree, and I guess really then kind of from your perspective, do you think that that's a, I guess, well-founded kind of sort of belief, just in your view, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, on one hand, like, yeah, ideally we'd have like a situation where we have like a benevolent ruling class that would take care of all those things without our needing our input, right? Um, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's really easy to go to the point where how much can you do for the public good or for the greater good before taking in the considerations of individuals, right? Like China sees like the sinification of like the Uyghur population as like a greater good kind of situation without consideration of their individual rights or their individual objections to what's going on, right? And I think that's really easy when you have a country with that much power. So I don't know. In a perfect world, yeah, I would love no democracy, right? But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I think the reason a lot of people like the US Constitution so much is because the founding fathers were also skeptical in a similar way of democracy, right? Like if you look at the Constitution and how the government is framed and at least how like elections used to work, the founding fathers put a lot of emphasis on, yes, we can have people popularly elect their representatives, but then the representatives are like this intermediary that, they're considered the more high-minded, educated class that are going to make most of the important decisions and nominate, a lot of actors in the government like judges and senators until the 17th Amendment was passed. So there was always that barrier where, people were electing representatives who would represent their general ideas and viewpoints, but then the representatives also had this like higher sort of status where they could conceptualize these big issues and take, kind of be like caretakers for the country in the way Socrates probably envisioned, right? Where like they're acting in the best interests of the country, not the interests of the voters.
Is that the origin of the Electoral College, sort of?
It is the origin of the Electoral College. And,
it seems super similar.
Yeah, and I mean, the Electoral College is also designed around a federal system of 50 states where, the states are all treated as equal. And I mean, that's kind of archaic. But part of the point is that, yeah, the Electoral College is and prevent demagogues from taking power. And it's supposed to, pick a president who will act in the best interests of, the country, national security and all of that, not just whoever the voters elect, right? But over time, that process has been, I guess degraded is an opinionated word, but it's been like transformed from its initial intent to one where like we now popularly elect senators who used to be chosen by state legislatures. And the Electoral College is basically, it doesn't have any real power. The electors are required to just choose the president who won, or the presidential candidate who won their state. So and you could argue that those changes have eroded America's system of government. Right now, we have like a very gridlocked sort of ineffective government that is constantly fighting within itself and is incredibly partisan because we have gotten rid of all of these barriers between populism and the running of the federal government. So I don't know.
Yeah, so I guess my response to the video is pretty similar to Justin's in that like I guess when I learned about democracy and republicanism, like the republic in like middle school and high school, like world history and stuff, it was always taught to me like, all right, first we had the Greeks and they figured out that democracy was like, pretty good, but like it doesn't work out like that great, because like when you have like the people deciding on things, like, you get shitty stuff like, uneducated masses and maybe like mob rule and I don't know, a whole host of things that I think are kind of touched on in the video. But then, once the Greeks fell out, like then we had the Romans, and they sort of figured out that like the next evolution of democracy was the republic, right, where you have elected representatives that might be democratically elected, but it's like these elected elite educated people that can then run the country. And so yeah, that's sort of like I mean, Justin says that like that's why people like the U.S. Constitution, but I tend to think that like that whole idea of republicanism comes from really the Roman Republic, which I mean, sort of lays the foundation for like all of Western civilization, and I mean, was like a pretty good empire. I mean, it deteriorated at some point, so maybe that could be like a fault of the republic, but like Rome did a pretty good job, and yeah, I think at least it had always sort of been clear to me throughout like my education that like this is a straight up democracy, like whatever the hell Greece did, maybe not the best idea. And so you kind of need like another layer, the representatives, to make it work out. So, I mean, I think the criticisms that I saw in the video are fair. I feel like we don't really have true democracy in its current state, and it's like that was sort of figured out like back in the Roman times because they're like, yeah, fuck that shit, let's do a republic. That was my response to the
yeah.
video.
I'd argue that we are more democratic in the sense that like a pure democracy is like the will of the people dictates out all of your policy and everything your government does. I'd argue we're closer to that than Rome or Greece was, right? Even Greece, which was like a direct democracy, just because like how many of our citizens or people living in the U.S. can vote, right, or enfranchised, versus how much of even like Greece is like direct democracy, right? Like I remember from Latin, and I can't be super sure, but I'm pretty sure in Greece it was only like the land owning male.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Right.
So like that element of the democratic ideals are certainly better upheld now than before, but I mean, you still elect congressmen and like you have state congress and like senators and all that stuff. They're all representing you, and they're the ones who are making the law, right, actually legislating. So
yeah,
I mean, it's still truly a republic in my eyes, more so
So
than
I was going to say that I think at this point we've already characterized what had been in my mind the two like criteria with which we assess the government, right? On the one hand, there's kind of behind everything we've said a kind of assessment of the results, right? At some level, we always care about whether the government makes a decision that, and it's going to be subject to opinion, but the correct decision, so to speak, right? We'll leave it at that. And then the other aspect is kind of, well, is there like a government that is inherently better than another one? Because I feel like, again, like as Alan was saying, that the fact that this whole enfranchisement and everything is like a core part of what America was founded on, or at least there's a perception of that right today. Like I think a lot of people have moved to the side of the spectrum where it's kind of like, as long as it's a democratic decision, it's got to be like that makes it okay, right? And it's less focused on like, okay, what is the decision, right? I mean, for example, I was reading another article a couple days ago I hope this isn't fake news, and if it is, like, I apologize for bringing it up here, but someone claimed that some of the Nobel Peace Prize guys had nominated Trump for receiving the Nobel Peace
Yeah,
Prize.
I'd
Yeah,
heard that. Yeah.
yeah. So,
I don't
and
know if it's true. Like to your
It's
point.
yeah,
so somebody from Norway. Like you need to be like some sort of statesman to put out a nomination.
yeah.
And so some statesman from Norway did it.
Okay. Yeah. So this op-ed was just, shitting on basically everything, right? It's like everything is bad. Like the moment Trump is in there, it must be bad, right? And so the interesting part to me was kind of just like a two-part process where, the op-ed talks about an interview with the guy who nominated Trump, right? He's like, okay, so in all fairness, right, look at what he was able to, be part of, right? If the credit doesn't all go to him, at least he was a president, kind of was part of that whole negotiation that went on. I actually don't know the details of the negotiation and the parties affected, but it seemed like it was something that people have been saying for a while, like, let's sort this out, let's be friends, let's be peaceful over there. Just no one was, it just never happened, right? And then Trump here was part of that process.
Oh, the normalization of Israeli relations
I think
with
that was part
the
of it.
country,
There was
right?
also a Kosovo-Serbia thing,
Okay.
but that was kind of the guy's justification, right? It's like, okay, he was part of a political process by which, you achieve some semblance of peace in a turbulent area, right? And, the op-ed's response was just like, that kind of peace doesn't mean anything because it wasn't democratic. It was just an agreement amongst like high level, bureaucrats and cronies. They agreed not to kill each other. It's not real peace. So like Trump shouldn't get any credit for that. Right? And so, I think that's kind of, it reminded me of this video. It just kind of like the, in his view, clearly the fact that something was arrived through a democratic process is in and of itself valuable. I don't fully agree with that. Um, like that's just me, right? But it's kind of like, so part of this is kind of like a personal thing. Like I want to hear if any of you guys feel that the democratic process is inherently valuable, kind of
I,
why you feel that way.
I agree with you, and part of my agreement, I want to take a moment to shit on the state of California, if you'll let
Okay.
me. California is a great example of why, democratically decided outcomes are not inherently good. The state of California famously banned gay marriage by popular vote, Proposition 8 back in what was 2008 or sometime in the 2000s. Through California's referendum process, they have frozen property taxes in place for the past 40 years, which has produced the current housing crisis. And because of their, popular vote emphasis, they can't undo that because it's so unpopular to raise taxes. I think a lot of California's referenda have just produced these bad outcomes, right? That have affected people's rights or have caused these crises in the state because there's no oversight, there's no moderating force in charge that says, hey, wait a second, maybe, lowering property taxes in perpetuity is a bad idea. And I think it's a great example of why, just because something is democratically decided and a majority voted for it, doesn't mean that, it's a good policy, or that it's good for most people. So I really think California and all of the California politics have kind of radicalized me in this way where I feel like we really do need representatives and like a barrier between the people and their government that kind of moderates policy and maybe is a bit conservative, a bit slower moving than the people would be, but it acts to like dilute a lot of these very immediate popular ideas, the Candyman sort of ideas, right? And puts into place policies that actually benefit the people of the state in the long run.
I mean, in general, I certainly agree that with both of you guys now have said that yes, democratically made decisions can often lead to worse outcomes. But I think, I don't know, one sort of nuance that I think is important for me is Like, it very much depends on the issue. Like, I think, at least for me, the dichotomy is you have domestic issues and you have foreign, international issues. And so what was mentioned by Kevin was the sort of peace brokering that's been done between Israel and I think it was like the UAE and Bahrain. They like now have like official diplomatic ties, right? So like both of these states will now like officially have embassies for these other countries. And I mean, yeah, sure, that's decided by political elites. And I guess this guy's complaint is that, this is just something decided by political elites and is not really something to do with the people. And so, I don't know, my first response to that is that, I don't know, I feel like for like foreign policy issues, it really is like the leaders of the country that sort of like dictate how that's gonna like go out, or like gonna play out. Because I mean, a lot of times, like maybe the like the people tend to be like more uneducated when it comes to foreign policy issues. But like sort of like as like a foreign policy actor, like I think countries are oftentimes spearheaded by like their leaders, and so I feel like having like sort of unilateral control over that is typically better for foreign policy issues, whereas maybe for domestic issues that like Justin mentioned in California, I think it's a little bit more naturally suited for the people to make those decisions. Maybe it leads to worse outcomes. I don't know, but I think it's like a more natural setting for like government by the people for the people when you have domestic issues. So that's sort of the first thought that came to mind for me. How like it sort of depends on the issue, whether democracy works.
So was the criticism in the op-ed that the agreements weren't decided by like through a democratic process, or that like the agreements didn't result in more democracy in the region?
I think it was the former. That's how I read it. It's just it was an agreement amongst bros basically who were like in control of their respective countries. Which, I mean,
So, I don't know. I think it's interesting because Israel is a very democratic society, right? I think the criticism is at least a little odd on that end, and that the Israelis do vote.
Kings. Yeah, it's not like kings are making the decision, right? It's like elected leaders, right?
Yeah. Well, at least in Israel. The others probably not, but yeah.
So, I mean, I don't want to get hung up on this this idea of what is or is not a worse outcome, because like that is the crux that's always subject to debate, right? Like if like more than half the people think that it's the better outcome, whereas maybe we're over here complaining that it's the worst outcome, right? Like it's not a very it's not very meaningful to argue back and forth on whether its outcome is good or bad. But I thought what was more interesting and like is Alan's point earlier, right? Like supposing we all agreed that better healthcare, better roads was a better outcome, right? That a lot of people would still be willing to sacrifice that just for kind of the enfranchisement, essentially, right? It's kind of like I want to like. Do you guys have any theories as to where exactly that comes from? Like that, fixation on this process, like because basically Justin's description of the Constitution was that that wasn't the original intent, at least in America's founding moments, right? Like it was something more of a hybrid, closer to the Republic that Osmond was describing. But like, how has it gone from that to now, right? Like, do you see like a particular driving force that has caused people to value the democratic process so much?
Yeah. So my first thought is that like, and part of the reason I think we instinctively feel like democracy works and it's really good is like temporal arrogance, right? In our lifetimes and from many generations before ours, you saw things get better over the course of your lifetime. When you're in America, at least, right? Technology gets better, healthcare gets better. Other things obviously have gotten worse, but by and large, we're better off than we were like 50 years ago, right? And we've seen that process over like at least the last 200 or 300 years in Western civilization. And if you look at the like broad span, like really over like 1,000 or 2,000 years, right? Like the curve has gone up in terms of like outcomes, right? So I think there's this instinctive like idea that every new idea or every new innovation we have tends to improve upon the last one or be better than the last one. which if you look at the long view of human civilization is not really the case, right? Like human civilization went like this. We almost went extinct at one point. We lost a lot of technological progress through, vast swaths of history, right? So it's not necessarily like, oh, because democracy, like we've come so far to this point where we have democracy. Democracy is good on its own just because it's newer, which is where I feel like a lot of people sit, right? Like it's the newest development upon a long line of Western civilization and thought, which doesn't necessarily make it good, but it has like this pedigree, so to speak, right? But now I think despite that, I think it has its own merits, right? And I think those merits sit on like the preservation of people's rights, right? Like do we think that people have rights to participate in how they're governed, right? And if we do decide that people have rights to do so, then do we exercise those or do we not? And if we choose not to, then we're I think once we take away people's rights, like the rights we think are owed to them, no matter where they are, then what common good is there, right? What good do you have if people's rights, if individual people's rights don't matter, right? And I guess to your point, like I know you asked at one point which is like the best kind of government, or like which government is best abstractly, and I don't necessarily think there is a best one in spite of democracy's like ability to preserve people's rights. And I think that's because, at least in consulting, I've seen that in a lot of organizations, there's they get things done in different ways, and the culture is really different, right? So some organizations are like democracy, where everyone has a say. Like even lowly like analysts get like they get to submit feedback on like organizational change, and the trade-off there is everyone is very happy with how things go in terms of like what happens, and people are more productive, and people feel heard more, and there's more innovation because people feel happy to speak up. On the flip side, a really simple transformation takes like forever because everyone feels like they need their voice to be heard, right? So it's like that level of bureaucracy and direct democracy, where I almost feel like is the reverse of Justin's example, where because everyone's voice needs to be heard and input needs to be heard, it takes forever to get things done. And like the reverse, like our company is very top down, not culturally, but in the way that like governance happens. And so our CEO and a bunch of like executives were like, all right, we're firing 10% of the company. That's it. No one has this, like, and just figure it out. We're going to execute 10% of the company, and we're going to call them low performers. And that shit happened real quick. And I think it preserved our stock value, right? But at the cost of everyone being super unhappy for being put on the chopping block. So I think there's always a tension between being like the will of the ruled being taken into account into the ruling class versus like not, right? There's trade-offs, but I don't say there's a clear like, best.
Yeah,
Sorry, that was
think,
like a lot of random thoughts I was having.
yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think if you look at like the status of democracy now, there's a pretty strong correlation between national wealth and democracy, at least on all these rankings of the level of democracy that magazines like The Economist and think tanks put out. I think people look at like the progress that's been made since World War II, and we've like developed these democratic societies in Europe and America that have avoided a lot of like the cataclysmic warfare of feudal Europe and 19th century Europe, right? Those problems have been solved, and I think people recognize it's by recognizing individual liberties and granting everyone a vote, and allowing this democratic process and encouraging multiculturalism. And I also think it's important to recognize that when people talk about like creating a democratic society, right? Like we want to bring democracy to the Middle East or something. It's not just about voting and representation in politics. It's also about all of these like other things that have been lumped into democracy, like a Bill of Rights that protects the freedom of speech and religion, and all of these Enlightenment values about equality. So I think people view democracy as like a set of ideals more than just like the rigid political process of voting. And I think, it has paid off. It works really well, and the world is more peaceful and less gory than it has been probably ever, in large part because so many societies have converted to democracy.
Okay, that's very interesting. To me, it seems almost like the two of you flipped kind of sides. Like I thought Alan's description of how there's no necessarily like super government that like works always. I thought that was a very measured and reasonable take on things, right? I do also believe that it's quite different from what most people will espouse as their belief on first pass, right? Like if you just grab, 100 people from across America, you kind of ask them, like, is there like a best system of government? I wouldn't be surprised if 70, 80% of them say, yeah, it's democracy, and be done with it, right? So on the flip side, like from my perspective, again, like Justin's drawn this correlation between the level of democracy and kind of the level of peace and prosperity. I mean, kind of without getting into the details of history, my impression was that democracy is the confounding factor. There are other underlying geopolitical factors that kind of shaped the state of peace and prosperity in the various parts of the world. And the fact that we can find this correlation, as you say, between democracy and those happenings, I think it's actually a confounding factor that's covering up real kind of sources.
Yeah, China didn't need any democracy. Look where it is now.
Well, I mean, look where it is now, right? I think you can look at the flip side and like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, when you say look where it is now, it's certainly come a long way in the last 50 years. Yeah, and I mean, like, it's much more peaceful than it was. I mean, certainly, like, but when you compare it to, like, say, the Cultural Revolution, like, I don't know, that's like a much more wide scale thing. Like as far as how far China has come, I feel like, and then just the last generation. Yeah, absolutely. It's there's certainly been just degradation of human rights. Certainly in China, that's like almost sort of the way things are in China. But the progression, I guess, of China's trajectory hasn't really needed the Western sort of ideals of democracy that Justin was talking about.
Well, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of China, but I will say, there's a viewpoint that like liberal democracy enables the kind of innovative thinking that makes countries prosperous in the long run. And I think, you could argue that a lot of China's wealth right now is based on like raw industrialization, right? It's manufacturing, it's processing raw materials and putting them together into iPhones and shit. But
with a billion plus people.
Yeah. But if the Chinese want to get to the next level of like this post-industrial economy that the US has achieved, where it can have its own like Silicon Valley that's creating these, consumer products from scratch that are, super compelling to most people. There's an argument that like in order to do that, you need this kind of dynamic, free market of ideas where anyone can kind of come up with anything, and venture capital can flow into different areas and target what it thinks is good ideas, right? It's like start your own business in your garage sort of thing. And I think a lot of people think that, you need free speech and free religion and all of these other things, in order to reach that level, right? So it remains to be seen. The Chinese experiment, I guess, in autocracy plus free markets is ongoing. So we'll see how it ends up.
Two points on that. One thing is, I would say, shifting our focus away from, say, China, that we could talk a little bit about South Korea versus North Korea and maybe Japan as well, right? I think I've read many historical accounts of the early days of South Korea's so-called democracy, and by most historians' kind of perspective, it really was just a democracy in name. It was just this powerful dictator-like family kind of controlling. It's almost like a military industrial complex, except there's no military because that comes from America. It's just this kind of like industrial kind of block, right? But they were committed to not just enriching themselves, but kind of developing the country, right? So it worked out, right? It worked out that way. And so it's kind of like, it almost seems to me that by that account, it's not really the form or the rights of people that really lead to kind of a stronger nation. It's kind of whoever's in charge, like the ruling elite, whatnot. They have to have a kind of like a dedicated shared vision that's what they want to go for. right? Because a lot of the dictators that we found in the Middle East prior to the Arab Spring, like one of the big problems was they were filthy rich. Like they just kind of took all the nation's productive capacity and kind of leveraged it in a way to enrich themselves rather than enrich the nation and make the nation stronger, right? Kind of in the same way, wanted to bring up Japan. This is pre-World War II, right? They had their emperor kind of all the way until they surrendered at the end of World War II, right? They also went through a period of extremely fast economic development, right? From the time when they first interacted with the Western kind of powers, right? Like, you know, they kind of rose above their peers in the region, right? Korea, China were miles and miles behind Japan. It didn't take a democracy. It just took a very focused government where it's kind of, we want to be the best. We want to make our nation strong. And we want to kind of like, you know, take over essentially. Now, the military aspirations, I'm not saying that those were great in the sense that, you know, a lot of people would have to die in the process, but kind of this whole idea of development, right? It just has to come from, it seems to me it has to come from like coordinated effort at the leadership level. And then lastly, just another point about the Silicon Valley thing. When you brought it up, that was a pretty big sore point for me because in what I've followed on the news about kind of China's technological development, um, I've come to the opinion that the problem isn't the system of government and the liberties and whatnot. The problem is there's already a world leader in that department, and that world leader doesn't want to see a strong competitor show up, right? So when China's like developments in 5G come out before America has a kind of a, you know, a counterpart, right? The Trump administration goes on and declares, oh, this is all national security. Y'all are just spying on us. But all the iPhones you manufactured previously, no, those weren't the problem. It's this new 5G thing that is going to be a national security threat, and then they shut it down, right? And there's all sorts of coercive methods I've seen kind of in order to facilitate that, right? So again, I have my doubts as to the necessity of democracy in facilitating economic development.
So, well, you know, you talk about. Oh, sorry, do you have something to say, Alan?
No, you can go first.
Okay. You talk about, you know, these competent governments that have a vision. You know, call the 5-year plan, if you will, for, you know, implementing like these economic programs, right? But like we have to ask, what system of government and society is most effective at producing competent leaders? And I think there's a strong case for democracy there as well, that democratic societies have shown that they can keep producing, you know, visionary leaders who can, you know, set a course for the nation. I mean, the U.S. has, you know, a long list of pretty great presidents who were able to take the mantle, and they came out of, you know, a society that valued free thought and the expression of ideas, and, you know, this broad-based public education system and these values of being able to express yourself and compete in the marketplace of ideas. And I think, you know, the problem with a lot of autocratic governments is, yeah, they might have a good leader come along and make a lot of progress in 20 years or however long they choose to lead. But after that, who comes up to replace them? If you don't have a broad pool of, you know, competent people who are skilled in like the language of leadership, which I think democracy does really well because it, you know, it's grassroots leadership, right? It encourages new leaders to come up all the time, and you have this constant like inflow of people and ideas that are just like being generated. Well, in an autocratic society, it's, you know, the ruling family, and if the family dies out, then they didn't, you know, do the heavy work of finding a replacement for themselves, and it all kind of falls apart. Right. So that's why I think democratic societies might be uniquely resilient, in that there's always a pool of talent to draw on.
Yeah, and I think like to that point, if we look at like the total package that just talked about, like not just democracy, like the will of the people, right? But like the recognition of human rights and having a liberal democracy. You know, when you think about like leaders, like, yeah, you could have many like great leaders for the economy or for developing your nation, right? But how quickly is that progress undone by a series of like one or two bad leaders, right? And like yeah, let's say you have like, you know, the idea that like you lose 50% of your like portfolio. It doesn't take another 50% growth to get it back. It takes 100% growth to get back to the point where you were, right? Like loss is so much more painful than growth, right? And I think the issue is that there's so much long-lasting power in autocratic governments that you know, a lot of the progress they make can be instantly unmade in a sense. And even the people who are doing good things, right? The things they're deciding to do are done on a whim, right? Like when you're not beholden to like the public will or to the ideals of like human rights, it really just is like, oh, I want to focus on developing our government. You know what? I think killing all the sparrows in our country is a good idea. Let's do that. You know, and like, I don't think you have the core principles that are necessary for guiding a country, right? And yeah, and also thinking about the point, like when we look at our modern economy and like who are the leaders in innovation and thought capital and technology, and yeah, absolutely, just in sheer like numbers, like China and Russia, like absolutely will have like a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators, right? But one of the US's big strengths is that like if you look at all these different measures, we're almost like, you know, third world country level, right? Like our public health measures, a lot of our infrastructure, it's like awful, right? Opioid addiction. But the one area we consistently topped out at is like private education, right? Or higher education, right? And beyond just higher education, it's our ability to attract talent into our country, like the top 1% of talent from all these different other nations, who will come here, move their businesses here, move their families here, because they know, A, there's opportunity, but even beyond the opportunity, they know that the government and the leaders can't take their rights away on a whim, right? And that's why even if I see like earning potential and quality of life in China and areas like Shanghai and Beijing compete against Silicon Valley, I don't see the same flow of human capital talent from Western countries to China, just because, you know, billionaires there can have all their wealth taken away, right? You can be executed on the spot if a government official decides that you can. And, you know, these entrepreneurs and scientists are intelligent, right? They risk adjusted return on making a move even for more money. It's not worth it, right? So until the government can kind of make itself more, I guess, accountable to individual rights, yeah, I think long term it's going to lose the war on talent and development. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you touched on a very great point that property rights are integral to kind of individualize, kind of like to align people's own incentives with kind of the development of a nation, right? If you can't kind of retain anything you've earned, then you know you're really not incentivized to, you know, make work happen. But this kind of goes back to Justin's point, where it's kind of like a lot of times when people talk about democracy, they're not actually talking about democracy literally. They're actually talking about a bunch of other things, such as property rights, which I feel like, importantly, is not uniquely tied to democracy, right? There are,
Yeah, it sounds like we're talking about capitalism and not democracy.
yeah.
Well, no, I'm talking about the idea that like you have confidence that your government will not kill you and your entire family down to the fifth bloodline on a whim. And the
I
only thing that
think
protects you,
That's a bit inflammatory, I'd say. I think it's a bit.
I don't know. I think
No,
a big Achilles heel of a lot of autocrats is that they like to execute educated people. Like you can look at
absolutely.
many genocides throughout modern history have included, you know, university students and the educated elite in those genocides because they're always
Doctors,
seen
right?
as a
Like,
threat. Yeah.
yeah, Stalin couldn't get himself a doctor because they had purged so many, right? Like that's not like an inflammatory thing. That's a real thing that happens because there's no systemic protection of individual rights, right? And until there is, the best aren't going to go there.
Well, I guess kind of as a counter, I don't know if it's a counterpoint, but like consider the following scenario. Suppose it was voted by popular democracy that, you know, uh, you know, okay, let's just go with some historical things. I don't want to say anything too hypothetical today. It's I think there was a lot of mistreatment of ethnically Japanese people during World War II here. That was popular. They should have rights. Yes. Did democracy protect them? No, they were a minority, right? You're not protected in principle just by the democratic system. If you're the majority, perhaps, but that's no different from an autocratic society where it's just kind of where's the power situated, right? If you want to, it's always situated with the folks who have the majority of the power, whether you distribute it in a kind of a by head basis or kind of like a by wealth basis. If those people are in a position to oppress, folks with less, then you're always at risk if you somehow, by luck of the draw, fall into the minority, right? I think the Chinese Exclusion Act in America, again, was a democratic country, but, hey, you guys don't count, right? You're not enfranchised, so fuck you all, right? Like I just don't think that this protection of rights is unique to democracy. I think protection of rights is important. Things like property rights are important for ensuring incentive alignment and progress. It's just, again, like I think people give that credit to democracy unduly, and that's why I kind of wanted to bring up the discussion. As like, what are the merits of democracy actually, and how much of it is actually democracy, not something else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, we're talking about pure majoritarian democracy where we're only talking about the voting aspect of it, right? Then, yeah, I think it's pretty useless unless you don't have like a set of liberal values and, a Bill of Rights and stuff like that to protect minorities from the majority. But I think that, again, a reason people like the Constitution is that, at least in principle and its founding intent, was to do that. And, it hasn't always achieved that. And, power corrupts, and presidents have wielded, and Congress have wielded their power unjustly many times in the past. But at least the intent of the country's origin was to secure those rights and not just have a pure, the founding fathers recognized that pure democracy was going to lead to some pretty ugly outcomes as well.
Yeah, and to obviously, there's a lot of issues that would cause rights to be violated, right? Like the U.S. was a democracy for 100 years before slavery was wiped out, right? So clearly, lots of injustice and violation of rights happen in democracies, right? But I think a key difference is that democracies leave open the room for further and further acknowledgement and betterment of those rights because they're reflecting the will of the people, right? And because they're looking out for the interests of the will of the people. Whereas autocratic governments, right? So the U.S. looks at a big wrong we did, a few wrongs like slavery, pre-civil rights movement, Jim Crow laws, right? And yeah, Japanese internment camps. And we as citizens can look at it, criticize our government, criticize our history, and say, in the future, we elect different leaders who don't make such policy decisions. And we have media who have the right to communicate these ideas to us so that we can make these informed decisions. Whereas in autocratic governments, they could easily, and often do, and often have, suppressed these ideas, right? Obviously lots of China, because of VPN, know about the 1989 massacre, right? But there's no political movement to change the government away from committing an act like that again. Whereas I'd argue in America, we're pretty far away from going back to Jim Crow laws or interning Japanese people, right? And that's because we're able to have this free flow of ideas and ability to change policy through, elections. Whereas in China, if they want to massacre their own people like that again, there is literally nothing stopping them.
I guess, I don't know, it's probably not helpful for this to turn into a China versus US sort of thing.
Well, I think they're two good examples because they're economically and militarily powerful governments who are very not aligned, politically, right?
I would add 2 comments to those the items you just mentioned, Alan. These days, I'm worried that given the right event that happens in America, George Floyd was an event that caused a lot of, I would say, unfortunate realities about kind of our citizenry to be exposed, right? I think it would just take another one of those sorts of events in a different context to, again, bring back those sorts of behaviors like the Japanese internment camps. I really feel like the polarized nature of US politics today makes it very ripe for that sort of thing. And then on the flip side, and what you talked about for China, I will say that it's very obvious to the citizens of China who lived through that period that there was a very big shift after that period. Despite the government's best efforts at kind of suppressing information transfer about what occurred that time, everyone knows that something big happened. And it was, and I think word got out that was when the government, who had for so many years claimed to be protecting the people, finally turned its guns on the people. The government lost a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of the people, because you can say what you will about the government promoting itself as the legitimate rulers. their legitimacy in the eyes of the people just declined dramatically. So it wasn't without consequence. It's not as though they could just do it again, because they're also very fearful of the social stability ramifications of kind of unilateral unjust actions would take. And that's actually a phrase that you'll see a lot in Chinese like political like discourse, like how the government talks about things. It's always about social stability, social stability, social stability. So it's not without cost.
So I'd say like there's certainly costs, right? And like I remember reading somewhere after a certain percentage of a country's citizenry rebels, no matter what government it is, the government has to institute some kind of change, right? Now I'd say that like when we look at our governments, right, like whether we're looking at like a republic or like an authoritarian government, do we like should it get to the point where you have like 7% of your citizenry in open revolt before there's wide systemic change? Or like does that make sense, right? Like they basically have that much margin of error to fuck up before they're like, oh shit, we got to worry about being taken out of power. Whereas in a democratically elected government, they get within like, oh, 10% of the country
50%.
thinks, yeah, like they're like, oh, this percentage of the country thinks I'm fucking up, like it's over, right? I better be doing a good job or I'm out, right? Whereas an authoritarian government is like, I have to motivate these people to sacrifice their lives before I have to restrict myself.
That's what I was going to say, is that democracy allows like, it's like a pressure valve, right? It like, it's a continuous release of like angst. You know, like every presidential inaugural speech has the phrase "a peaceful transfer of power." You know, every president's like, yes, the peaceful transfer of power from one administration to another is one of the greatest things about America. But I think it's kind of true, because like it demonstrates that, yeah, when Americans are dissatisfied with George W. Bush or Donald Trump, maybe, we can change our government without anyone dying. And that's a great thing. That's sort of,
that is a great thing.
it's a great thing.
Yeah. I mean, clearly there's a lot of issues with democracy, right? I think it's the worst system except all the other ones, you know. I would love if a perfect king could rule us forever, like Aslan. If Aslan could come and make all their laws and fix our healthcare and shit, I'd be all for it. I wouldn't need a vote, but as long as we have flawed leaders and selfish people, I think we need checks on them, and I think democracy is the best way to do it.
Now, Kevin, like with regard to what you were saying about like one big event being the, you know, the tipping point between the U.S. now and the U.S. is like an autocracy, I think, you know, I kind of agree, but I didn't want to turn this debate into like me and Alan like just defending the U.S. as, you know, the best and most virtuous example of a democratic society, because it's really not. I think the U.S. Constitution is deeply flawed, especially in our current context. It's being challenged in ways that the founding fathers and the people who wrote it did not intend, right? And it's really showing its weaknesses, especially with this current Supreme Court issue, and the partisanship and the role of the Senate in a country that, you know, made up of 50 states that don't really matter as much as they used to. So, you know, I think you can't really look at the US now as like your good example of democracy and the good outcomes of a democratic society. I think a better example would be like a parliamentarian system like in Germany or Australia. Right?
Yeah, I was about to ask you for a better example because I'm curious about.
Yeah, because like I really like the parliamentary system because I feel like it's more effective at that sort of representative aspect, you know, the Republican aspect of government. Like in a parliamentary system, you vote for the party, right? And the party kind of forms the government independently of the people in a way.
Wait, isn't that what we do here?
Well, here you're kind of here you're voting for the president, who is, you know, currently definitely has a cult of personality around them. I guess they all do, really, and you know, is definitely a singular figurehead that you can project your personal feelings onto. And then you're also voting for senators who are increasingly like rambunctious, and representatives, and you know, you're voting for all these figureheads. But in a parliamentary system, it's more about voting for a party that has a platform, and then the party kind of organizes itself, and it's not quite as glued to the whims of voters and the cults of personality that seem to form in the US, right? Like, I can't think of like many equivalents of like a Ted Cruz in Australia or Canada. The individual members of the party matter less, and the party's vision matters more. And I mean, the result is that in a parliamentary system, they can just change the leader of the party on a whim, right? Like, they don't have to go back and have an election. If they're like, oh, we don't like the prime minister, they just kick them out.
Oh, because they're like, they're hurting our party. Right.
Yeah, well, they literally are like, oh, this prime minister will probably lose this next election, so we're just going to switch them out, and it doesn't require anyone except party members to vote, and it can just happen, instantly. But I think it's been really resilient in Europe and Australia and Canada, and it's produced like a system of government that like has like people have a voice, right, and the will of the people is expressed very effectively. But it also, I think, it's produced governments that operate in a better caretaker capacity, right? Like, I was reading about this at High Court of Australia the other day. I'm thinking about the Supreme Court and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and reading about like their judicial selection process. And it's so much less polarized than it is here, right? They just kind of like select these judges, and people all agree on them, and they're extremely qualified. And I was wondering, like,
it used to be like that.
Yeah, it used to be like that, but what's happened, right? And why is it so difficult now in the United States to have like an impartial judiciary? And I think it really has to do with the fact that in Australia and these other countries, the governments that are formed are not quite as activist, right? Like they're amorphous. The prime minister in Australia has changed like 5 times over the past 7 years or something. It's really about like national policy priority instead of like these particular pet issues of individual presidents, and that's the way I see it.
That's really interesting, because I was thinking earlier like on the difference between a democratic and autocratic society, and I was thinking a key similarity is the people in power are the people, like, they're not necessarily the people best equipped to rule or to make policy decisions. They're the people best equipped to accumulate and gain power, right? Like, the people at the top are the people best at getting votes, not the people best at making sure your country run well. And the parliamentary system kind of gets rid of that, right? You're looking at you're voting for policy, and then within that party, they select who's good at ruling. And I guess you'd end up saying like, yeah, the prime minister is probably the person who's best at influencing people and winning people to his side, right? But I think it's good separating the idea of like the most popular or the most power hungry person from the person who has the most power, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I won't say that like the parliamentary systems don't have political figureheads who accumulate power and do things for votes, because they do. But it seems like a much more subdued system where there's just not as much exposure to like this showboating for votes, right? Again, going back to the Ted Cruz thing.
Can you guys believe that South Korea like straight up arrested and then imprisoned their former president? Like, isn't that like kind of like that thought kind of bizarre to you guys?
I think it makes perfect sense.
No, I agree. I think it's great, but it feels weird, almost like
well, because that's what I was saying. It's not. That's why I was like that. The early days of the presidency in South Korea wasn't like a president thing. It was more like a Gorbachev thing, right? It's like Stalin was terrified that after he left office, he would just be, mutilated in death, and that's exactly what happened to him, right? So this is kind of like a more tempered version, where it's like, oh, we're just completely discrediting you as a person. You're out of power. You're just not relevant anymore. And by the way, I'm gonna slap you in the face, like put you in the dirt. That's how I saw it. But
so I have an interesting proposal for you guys, right? So a key feature of the Commonwealth countries, Australia, Canada, the UK, and all of the former UK colonies, the other ones, is that they have the Queen as their head of state, right? And like technically under like the Australian Constitution, for example, the Queen has some authority, right? The Queen in Australia appoints the Governor General, who technically approves what the government does. So when the government of Australia appoints someone to their high court, the governor general, who was not elected by anyone in Australia, could theoretically strike down their choice or say, no, you can't do that. And actually, in the 1970s, Australia had a constitutional crisis when the governor general dissolves the government of Australia because he wanted to, I guess. There was some sort of big like gridlock in parliament over some legislation, and the governor general was like, nope, you're all out, you know, we're having a new election or something. And it was a big shit show, and there was much reforms. But like, I guess the entire idea of it is that like in a constitutional monarchy, you have like this pressure valve, right? Where like if things get too heated within a democratically elected government, then the monarch can kind of step in and be like, hey, you know, we need to like do things differently. We need to have a new election. We need to, you know, reform this process. I don't know if you think that's an effective idea. You know, when government breaks down and democracy doesn't seem like it's working, or if it's a dangerous one.
My impression is that I hate it, and purely just because it's like, what if people are like, we need to balance the budget. The ruling class is currently, you know, costing us $20 billion a year. Let's have that. The guy's like, oh, nope, that's out. That's out. Sorry, no more healthcare for the poor. Cutting that shit in half. New government, don't propose that. Obviously an extreme example, but I don't know. I just feel like any system that's checked by the whims of someone who it isn't beholden to the will of the people is just so dangerous to me.
That's the U.S. judicial system.
I think
exactly.
it's
I
interesting
agree. I don't
That's
think
the U.S. judicial system.
it kind
You
of
have
is.
I
judges
disagree
that
with them being here for life.
But another interesting example is Thailand, right? Thailand is a democracy. It has been since I think the 1930s.
Doesn't it have
But
a king still?
they still have a king. It's a constitutional monarchy. But this is a great example of where the king has actually stepped in multiple times. Thailand has had multiple coups where the military takes over the government. And, you know, it has a long history of this kind of shit. And each time it seems like the king will step in and be like, hey, you can't do that, right? Or he'll step in after the military takes over and moderate what the military does. Which obviously it's not very healthy, you know, like Thai government it's gone through a lot of up and downs, and there's been some violence as a result of these coups and this like, this weird relationship between the military and civilian governments. But the point is the king has kind of been this like role player in that he's maintained Thailand's democratic society, right? Like Thailand is still a democracy in spite of having the military try to take over so many times and implement its own will. So I don't know, maybe in like developing countries where like civilian control of the military isn't established, it's useful to have like a monarch who at least believes in democracy. It seems like each Thai king has believed in democracy and is willing to kind of step in and save democracy from being destroyed. I don't know.
Yo, I'm down if he gets a literal sword of Damocles hanging over him. And if like 70% of the civilians hate him, that sword drops and he's done. He's killed, right? That way, he's like, yeah, he's the check, but then the people are the check on him. It's all a great circle, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, the thing about constitutional monarchy is that, like, you know, the Queen of England doesn't have any real power anymore, right? Like, it was all whittled away by having, you know, the people eventually have a greater and greater role in like what the monarch does. I don't know. It's all really a thought experiment. I just wanted to throw these ideas out there because, like,
I think ultimately
why
you
not?
do have to pick your poison. I would go back to Alan's original point a while back. There is no perfect system of government, right? You either give the sword to the enlightened individual who you have faith in, or you give it to the mob and hope that they, by intuition, pick the right decision, right? People are always going to make bad decisions. It's just kind of like, who do you want to make bad decisions for? But or who do you want to be in charge of making those bad decisions? And I guess my view is that, you know, that's the thing. We should be focused on kind of who should be more on what decisions were made. Osmond, did you want to say something?
I don't know. I mean, nothing in particular. I don't know. I've just been thinking about like I don't know, sort of the fundamental question that you asked us about, like, I guess, democracy versus other forms of government. And I'm just trying to think about like, how do we like sort of strip that question down to like sort of the core elements of what a democracy is? Because I don't know, I feel like a large part of this discussion has gotten maybe like sidetracked by like, I don't know, how democracy gets implemented and like, things like, I think you made a very good point earlier that like democracy is not beholden to individual rights. And I think democracy is not beholden to peaceful transfer of power or all the other things that we see in like a good government and a good stable government. And so, but like, I think you made a very good point just now about like democracy being about like who makes bad decisions or who gets to make the decisions, right? Because the point I liked was that people are going to make bad decisions, right? Like, dictators, authoritarians, the mob, the people, like people make bad decisions. And I guess I just feel like with democracy, there is sort of a sense of agency in the decisions, like by the people, right? At least it was the people who made this decision. And that is ultimately like the value of democracy. That the country is ruled by the people for the people. And so like if they make a bad decision, then at least like we made the decision, right? Not just like one dude. And so yeah, that's, I don't know. Those are just some thoughts that have been floating around in my head.
Right. And you go ahead.
No, nothing. That's it.
Yeah, no, I think that point, right? Like that when you strip it down, it's about like where are you putting power to make these decisions? And because like at the end of the day, we're flawed human actors. It's about the power, right? But I also think that we can design systems that we work in that incentivize or disincentivize certain decisions, right? Like if we make it out like, oh, either like the mob's going to choose to execute, a minority, or the king's going to execute them, and yeah, that absolutely has happened in both, right? But I think again with a system that reflects the will of the people effectively, whether through direct democracy or a representative system, I think we can design and incentivize choices to maximize public good in a way I don't think you can with too much power concentrated in autocracy, right? Like if a dictator looks at like a company, like a country's budget, his choice is between enrich myself and my friends, and then choice A for public good, choice B for public good, choice C, D, E, et cetera, right? Whereas an elected official who's checked on his power can only make choices A through E, right? There is no option. Well, there shouldn't be. Obviously, there often is, but there shouldn't be an option to only enrich himself or his friends. But when you give people that unchecked power, there is always implicitly that option, right? So when we have a system that can incentivize people to make choose between two decently good options versus an objectively bad one, like enriching yourself, I think that's the system that we.
So again, I don't think democracy is beholden to good options. Is sort of the thing, right? Like that's, I feel like sort of the point that Kevin has been trying to make over the last hour. Like democracy is not beholden to protecting individual rights or beholden to peaceful transfers of power or options A through E.
Well,
right?
But,
like it's like bad decisions come from everybody. It's just like,
so
who are we okay with making these bad decisions? And I don't know. I feel like that's sort of the crux of the issue.
So I hard disagree on democracy not being tied to individual rights, right? Like why include the masses in the decision-making process if you don't believe that they're entitled to express that will?
Well,
Right?
one agnostic way of looking at it is that, maybe it's because the best system has multiple points of failure, right? If the masses are making the decision, kind of like you said, at least a bad decision was made, but at least the masses made it. There were multiple like people making the decision, and they all had like their own viewpoint on it. So like, maybe it's a better system when there's a large number of people making a decision versus one, right? Because with one person, you're kind of prone to their risk taking and their propensity to fail, right?
These the individual rights that we were talking about previously were like things that you might find in the Bill of Rights, or I mean, you were sort of like the rights that you were sort of like talking about earlier was like the right to life of you and your family if suddenly the dictator disagrees with you, right? Like certainly those rights need to be upheld, and they're I mean, Kevin has been talking about property rights, but I guess like fundamentally, what is the right that we're talking about in democracy? It's the right to govern by the people, and I don't know, like.
Let's take it to a lighter note. Let's talk about imposter, right? Uche gets so frustrated when the mob makes the lynching decision, right? And then the guy's not an imposter. right? Like, sometimes the guy is an imposter, sometimes it's not, right? But that's the thing, right? Like, normally would say, hey, everyone has a right to kind of defend themselves in kind of this sort of hearing about why they're innocent. But sometimes the mob is just like, nope, enough said. You're done, right? Like, in the same way, like if we had like a dictator in the imposter thing, then dictator could kind of, like in the way Justin was saying, like step in and say, no, okay, these are rights we're
The
going to
sheriff
uphold.
and Bane.
Yeah, you can't just say, today I'm pissed, we're going to go lynch all the people who belong to this category, because they're a minority, right? They have no way to defend themselves in a democratic system, right? That's what happened to Socrates, basically, right? If you had a guy like an overlord coming in and say, guys, come on, seriously, you're just going to like kill him just because of this? Like, let's calm
Or I
down,
guess
right?
like the seer and werewolf.
Right. So, these people can step in to preserve rights in ways that democracies cannot, right? So, and that's why I kind of like, as Osmond was saying about what I was trying to kind of portray, is kind of like the democracy again is not attached to these good outcomes. Like, it is really just, who gets to make the decision. And the fact that, a lot of people made the same bad decision, that doesn't give me any comfort personally, right? Like, even if it's like the people made the decision, like, you still fucked up. Like, I don't see how that's better just
Well,
because we all fucked up.
that's what I was trying to say, is that, if you try to look at this idea in this most abstract form, I think it's better when a very large number of agents use their mental powers to come to a decision, right? And I feel like if it's like 100,000 people versus one autocrat, right? 100,000 people using all of their mental ability are more likely to come to the right solution as a collective than that one person is, who might have a 50-50 chance of being like coming to the right or wrong decision, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Jumping on that train, have you guys ever heard a stadium of people sing versus any random person sing? The stadium of people sounds much more on tune or on pitch or whatever the musical term is than any individual person, because they all kind of cancel each other out until they're about where it should be.
Yeah, so maybe there's oh, sorry.
Go
Sorry.
ahead. No, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so I was just going to say, there's maybe your super agnostic, stripped down argument for democracy is that in aggregate, very large numbers of people make more intelligent decisions than individuals.
Right, and I think there's an implicit like, yeah, all these people. Okay, let's use Among Us. I like this because I was thinking along those lines. In Among Us, you're the implicit idea is like, oh, all these people are making these terrible decisions a lot of the time. So what you're saying is, maybe not you specifically, but often what Autocrat would say is, I would make better decisions than these crowds of fools, right? In Among Us, I would pick Uche out as the imposter every time he was, versus all these people. But so I want you to consider, right? Like, when in Among Us, when we all contribute, and this is like a real world, right? Because there are bad actors in Among Us who we don't know are bad actors, just like there's bad actors in real life. They're interested in their own good. They're pursuing a different agenda than the public good, just like in real life, right? So I think it's a great analogy, right? And then the minority too. So in Among Us, all of us work together and we make a good decision about 50-50, right? And that's with many points of view, all of us contributing to a decision based on what we see and what we hear from other people, right? Now, if we took an autocrat and the autocrat himself or herself made that decision every time, I think they do worse than 50-50. I think when they don't listen to the
but sometimes you're playing a different game, and sometimes you're the seer, right? And you have more information about everybody, right? But it's like, do we trust this one person? It's hard to place the blame into this one person. Like, so like, and I'm saying like, the agnostic sort of stripped down argument that Justin was making, like sometimes there's one person who is enlightened, right? The enlightened dictator or whatever. And so there's varying levels of education in the people, right? And so like, do we want everybody? Like, do we want like all 100 people in the aggregate making the decision, or just like the educated people making the decision, or one really smart dude making the decision? And I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
no, I think that's a great point, because like, yeah, I mean, like, absolutely, we want like good-willed, intelligent people making the decision, right? But like, is that like extra 20%, 30% of benefit from having a very intelligent, powerful person outweighed by the inevitable chance that a bad actor with all that power comes in, right? It's like the 50% loss versus 100% gain. Is all of that benefit going to be outweighed by the bad leader?
To that point about secession, I think a truly enlightened leader would also be able to pick out a truly enlightened successor. So in theory, that problem is solved. But
Has there ever been one then?
I think unfortunately I have to go back to China a little bit because
Sure.
I just don't know as much about other cultures' histories. I think the transition after Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping was a very enlightened one because Deng Xiaoping kind of got rid of the single dictator thing and he created this tribunal system. And that's how it's been up until Xi Jinping, who kind of reverted it back, right? I think that that has done good things for the country, that kind of decentralization. Okay, but I don't want to speak too much more about that because it's a complicated issue. What I will say though, earlier when Justin's saying, if we 50,000 people all used our mental capacities to like come up with a decision, even if it's bad, like, and I'm just like, well, let's think about that. If it's bad, right? I think the real difference here is that it's much harder to blame the mob for making a bad decision because chances are you're part of the mob. You're not going to blame yourself. It's much easier to blame that one guy who, yeah, he was the one who really caused us to do all these bad things. I think that's what happened in Germany with Hitler, right? That they all pointed to say, yeah, he was the guy who incited us and like got us riled up to like persecute and do all these terrible things. But realistically speaking, the only reason he was able to rally everyone into doing those things is because on some level it was being supported. Right? You can rationalize and justify how you were being manipulated all you want, but I think really that really comes down to being the difference. It's much easier to say, hey, this was an autocratic system. That one guy fucked up. He's the problem. Autocracy is the problem. Whereas in a democratic system, we all fucked up. Let's just not fuck up next time, right? Like that's kind of like we'll give it a pass.
So I actually have a great case example for like an enlightened autocracy, right? And I'd read it in this investing book where, obviously a company is a great example of an autocracy. The only, especially a private company, right? You're not really beholden to public shareholders, right? So this was an investment firm that created basically the investing A team. They took people across all these disciplines, like data analytics, all these economists, successful stockbrokers, like basically people looked at this team and they said, these guys are going to generate the craziest returns of the last like few centuries, right? Just based on their expertise and their proven track record, right? And the long and short of it is within a year or two, their proven, like back-tested, rigorously tested algorithm that was supposed to generate tons of return crashed their entire fund into the ground because of some extraneous factor they hadn't considered, right? And it wasn't like they didn't outperform the S&P 500. They literally like had to return like the 10% left of their investors' money, right? Because they had failed so spectacularly, right? And so I don't know. I just feel like there's so many trade-offs where we're giving up for going from democracy to autocracy in pure saying like decision-making ability, right? Going from democracy to autocracy, we're giving up so much that we've spoken about in this conversation, only for a group of experts that may just fuck up anyway, right? And so if we're going to be making all these sacrifices and taking all these potential risks to give all this power to this group of people, only for the outcome to be the same, why not make those sacrifices to begin with? Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm communicating that idea clearly.
Yeah, like, why trust all the smart people? They're in just their ivory tower. Like they don't know any
Well,
better.
but no, we're not saying we're not going to get smart people anyway, right? We're saying if we're going to take away accountability, we're going to take away the checks of the will of the people. And yeah, like even if we don't talk about succession, even if you democratically elect someone, right? Like we're gonna like bend ourselves to the whims of these powerful people. At the very least, we would expect outperformance relative to all the other governments. But we really aren't guaranteed that just because of how people are, right? Like a smarter person isn't like an i7 processor versus an i5 where they're linearly better, right? Like a dumber person with more integrity might be a better policy.
But like, I just think like Kevin's whole point here has been like why he introduced this topic is about like why do we inherently value this idea that we need these rights, like that, like it's like you've made this implicit assumption that like, oh, if I let this guy make the decision, then I have been disenfranchised in some way, and this is some like wrong that has happened to me, right? And so like, why is that a wrong? Why is like,
No. I mean, I think that's what we're exploring here, right? Like because we've talked about the outcomes, right? And now I'm coming from an outcome-driven perspective where we like when we make that trade-off, and we've acknowledged there's a trade-off between power of the people versus power of the few elite or the one person, right? There are trade-offs, right? Like you maybe make quicker decisions, you can be more expedited, right? And obviously, like maybe minorities get violated either way. And we've had all these questions about the implications of where the power sits, right? And once we have the conversation about like the implications, I mean that's the only way we can analyze who to give the decision to, right? It's not purely intellectual. We have case studies in history, right? And what I'm saying is, if we're looking purely based on outcomes, I don't think any of us has a waterproof case either way. I think that's fair to say, right? There's good and bad examples of each, right? But if none of us have waterproof, like if none of the outcomes are really like, oh, this way is 100% better. Even if we say all of Justin's evidence that all these democratic countries have not produced greater economic and public health benefits, even if we strip all that down and say every country is the exact same in outcome, then why not do the one that makes the most people happy? Right? Like everyone wants to vote, everyone really wants their voice to be heard. Even if we say every democratic versus autocratic country has the same outcomes in policy, you might as well make more people happy. And then if we're going to look at that, then we say like, oh, then we have to look at outcomes if that's not how we're going to determine it. And that's why the outcome decision, I think, has been so important.
Yeah, but I still like this rabbit hole of trying to figure out like a purely like theoretical argument for why democracy is good. I feel like it's like you could think of a thought experiment, right? Like, okay, let's say like a country has to make like a decision every month, right? And you have two ways of doing it. The first way is you poll 100,000 people every time you make the decision, and you do whatever they say, that the majority says, right? The other way is you pick a random person out of that 100,000 and have them make the decision. Which would you trust more? I think I would trust the 100,000 people, because like
100,000 every time.
Like the one person, you will like have, you know, a 50-50 chance of that person being either more intelligent than the average of the 100,000 or less intelligent. But if they're less intelligent, then they make a really shitty decision that puts everyone back. Meanwhile, the 100,000 will like regress to the mean intelligence of the group, and they will always, like in aggregate, they will make each time they will make like a purely average decision, right? I don't know. I think
maybe,
like,
or you can give everybody
like
a test and call it the Gaokao, and then see who scores the best. We take the top 1% and they can make the decision, right? I mean, there's like a lot of different ways to decide who gets to make the decision.
Yeah, I would totally go for that if you could come up with a perfectly designed test.
Right. So I'd say like let's go further in the thought experiment to Ozen's point, right? We have test two things, right? Social cognizance, right? Are you a good person? Are you gonna make like things that are to the benefit of not yourself but to everyone else in aggregate? Are you ethical? So number two, IQ. Are you smart enough to process all this information, take into account the most variables, and make the optimal decision, right? Then we take the 100,000 most qualified and have them decide. I think that's the best system.
Yeah. Who writes the test?
Those 100,000 people.
Right.
I think, yeah, kind of being cognizant of the time, I think we've made some good progress away from kind of just this like a naive belief that, just certain things are good. I think at this point, we all believe a lot of things are contingent on other things, right? Like the value of, like having the better roads and whatnot is contingent on certain other like property right freedoms or whatnot, right? So I think this good discussion, right? It's not clear that there's a particular system of government that is the best, right? I think we were onto something at the end where it's kind of like, well, if the outcomes are the same, then is one better than the other? I think that's a good framework to think about it. It's just maybe that's something we'll have to explore a little bit more carefully in the future.
I do think it's fun thinking about how do we, for guys in their early 20s, design the perfect government. I think that's fun. Like to that point.
Perfect government is the one where I'm the leader.
Point of view gun, right? The point of view gun.
Oh yeah.
Yes, the point of view gun.
Yeah.
Just give me that and it'll all be fine.
Implementing the Gaokao into our government, we would be doing something about climate change right now. Right? I am totally on board with that idea.
That's how Chinese dynasties used to be run.
Yeah,
All the
that's why I brought it
bureaucrats
up. Like that's
would-
like to like ascend the social ladder in China, you just have to do well in this test.
Exactly. Well, so look at Xi Jinping. He's like, all right, I have the smartest 0.1% of people in China. They're all like, yes, sir. Yeah. Here's our advice, sir. You invade this country, and he's like, I'm gonna drink mercury instead. Sir, we don't know. I'm gonna drink mercury to be immortal. That's the issue with monarchs.
Right. Yeah.
Absolute fool.
Right.
All right. Then yeah, I
All
think
right.
this is a good time to wrap it up. So
Yeah.
recording here.